The illusion of a perfect partnership, my friendship with Elena, was once considered the gold standard in the high-stakes world of architectural design. We were the perfect complementary duo. I, Leo, was a quiet, meticulous visionary who lived in the world of blueprints and structural integrity, while Elena was a charismatic, fast-talking face of the firm who could charm a contract out of the most stubborn city officials. For 7 years, we built Thorne and Vance from a tiny garage operation into a boutique powerhouse that landed projects usually reserved for international giants. I trusted her with my creative soul, my professional reputation, and exactly 51% of the business capital. I never suspected that behind her polished, supportive exterior, she was rotting with a secret, bitter resentment toward my majority share and the industry's recognition of me as the true genius of our team. The grand library ambition, the betrayal, began in the shadows of our firm's most prestigious project yet, the restoration of the historic Grand Library. This wasn't just another contract. It was a career-defining opportunity that required absolute mathematical precision and a deep, intuitive understanding of 19th century structural engineering. It was a project I had dreamed of leading since my university days, a legacy piece that would stand for centuries. Elena, however, saw it only as a massive payday and a strategic chance to finally step out of my shadow and push me out of the firm entirely. She began secretly meeting with the CEO of our biggest rival, a corporate predator named Sterling who ran Apex Design, offering him proprietary weaknesses in my structural vision so his company could underbid us and humiliate me publicly. The first cracks in facade, I first noticed something was wrong during a routine site visit, when a lead material supplier mentioned a major change order that I hadn't authorized. The supplier seemed confused, mentioning that my partner had requested a cheaper, lighter grade of steel for the foundational supports. When I confronted Elena in her office, she didn't even look up from her phone, simply laughing it off with a practiced, dismissive air. She told me I was being neurotic and overanalyzing things as usual, suggesting that the stress was finally getting to me. "You look exhausted, Leo," she said, her voice dripping with a false, saccharine concern. "Why don't you take a week off? I'll handle the boring paperwork and the city inspectors. You need to clear your head." The decision played a long game. It was in that moment, seeing the slight, triumphant glint in her eyes, that I knew she was moving against me. I realized that my voice would never be heard if I argued, so I decided to play the role she had cast for me, the burnt-out, struggling genius. I told her I would take her advice and head to the coast for a well-deserved vacation. However, instead of packing a suitcase, I spent the next 18 hours in a secret co-working space across town, setting up a silent, remote monitoring system on our firm's secure server. I created a honeypot, a fake project environment that looked identical to the real library files but contained hidden tracking software and mathematical traps that only a qualified engineer would recognize as flawed. Watching the sabotage from the shadows from my remote workstation, I watched with a heavy heart as Elena accessed my private design folders within hours of my supposed departure. She wasn't just looking. She was systematically leaking what she believed were my flawed foundation calculations to Apex Design. She thought she was handing them the keys to my professional ruin by showing them where they could cut costs and underbid us. Because she lacked the technical depth to understand the complex physics of the library's dome, she didn't realize that the excessive support she was encouraging Apex to remove were actually the only things that would prevent the building from collapsing under its own weight. She was unwittingly handing our rivals a mathematical death trap. The digital paper trail as the days passed, the digital evidence grew into a mountain. I watched Elena delete my original, ironclad safety files and replaced them with forged versions that made me look incompetent and reckless. She was meticulously building a narrative of my mental decline, documenting errors that she claimed to have found in my work. She was so blinded by her greed and her desire for the $2 million consulting fee Apex had promised her that she didn't notice the tracking pixels I had embedded in every document she touched. Every keystroke, every file transfer, and every late-night email to Sterling was being logged onto an encrypted blockchain server that she had no hope of accessing. The poisoned staff meeting midway through my vacation, Elena held an impromptu staff meeting at the office. I watched through the security camera feed as she stood in front of our loyal team, her eyes welling with fake tears. She told the staff that I was struggling with a severe mental breakdown and that the library project was in jeopardy because of my erratic and dangerous designs. She asked them to trust her as she navigated a potential merger with Apex to save the firm from bankruptcy. It was a breathtaking performance of betrayal. She was successfully poisoning my reputation with the very people who had looked up to me for years, all while wearing the mask of a grieving, loyal friend. The eve of the final bid the night before the final city review, I received a cold, formal email from Elena. She stated that as a managing partner, she had found it necessary to remove my name from the final library bid due to safety concerns. She informed me that she would be representing the firm alone at the city council meeting the next morning. I didn't reply. I just sat in the dark of my study, looking at the final simulation results. The optimized design she had sold to Apex had a 100% failure rate. She wasn't just trying to take my company. She was willing to risk the lives of everyone who would eventually walk into that library just to satisfy her ego and her bank account. The arrival at City Hall the morning of the bid arrived with a heavy, overcast sky that matched the tension in my chest. The city council chamber was packed with architects, journalists, and city officials, all waiting to see who would win the most prestigious contract in the city's history. Elena arrived with the Apex design team, looking like a queen in a $3,000 power suit. She was laughing and shaking hands with the Apex CEO, Sterling, their body language shouting that the deal was already done. They moved with the confidence of people who thought they had already buried their enemy. I walked in 5 minutes late, wearing my usual simple suit, and took a seat at the very back of the room, invisible to them. The Apex presentation Sterling, the Apex CEO, took the stage first. He was a man built on arrogance and expensive haircuts. He began his presentation by mocking our firm's archaic and over-engineered approach. He pulled up the stolen blueprints, the ones Elena had forged, and used them as a slideshow to demonstrate my incompetence. Thorne and Vance's original design was a catastrophe waiting to happen, he told the board, his voice full of mock pity. It's a tragedy when a great mind finally snaps, but luckily my team and the brave whistleblower from within his own firm found the errors before it was too late. Elena's master performance, Elena, was invited to speak as the neutral expert who had uncovered my mistakes. She stood at the podium, her voice trembling with a practiced, theatrical sincerity that made the council members lean in with sympathy. It breaks my heart to say this, she told the board, but Leo is no longer fit to lead this project. I've spent weeks trying to fix his dangerous calculations, but in the end, I had to agree that Apex's cost-saving measures are the only way to move forward safely. She looked directly into the cameras, playing the role of the tragic hero who was sacrificing her friendship for the sake of public safety. The quiet intervention, when it was finally my turn to speak, the atmosphere in the room was openly hostile. The board members looked at me with a mixture of disgust and pity. I didn't open a folder of blueprints or try to defend my character. Instead, I simply stood up and asked the council for permission to run a real-time structural simulation using the optimized data that Apex had just presented. Sterling laughed, and Elena smirked from the front row, whispering something to the man next to her. By all means, Professor Thorne, Sterling sneered. Let the computer show everyone exactly why you're finished. The simulation of doom, I plugged my tablet into the chamber's main projector. The room watched as a 3D model of the library, built strictly according to Apex's cheaper numbers, appeared on the giant screens. I hit the simulate load button. At first, the digital building stood tall, but as the virtual weight of the historic lead roof was added, the foundations began to groan and twist. In a horrifying slow-motion cascade, the entire west wing of the library collapsed into a pile of virtual rubble. A massive, flashing red warning appeared across every screen in the room. Total structural collapse, 100% fatality probability. The silence of the boardroom, the silence that followed was so thick you could hear the hum of the projector. The council members looked at the rubble on the screen, then at the Apex CEO, whose face had turned the color of wet cement. I didn't give them time to recover. I toggled the display to show the source of the data Apex had used. I revealed the secret email chain between Elena and Sterling, the timestamps of the file thefts, and the digital forensic trail that proved the errors Apex found were actually forgeries created by Elena. The friend who had tried to orchestrate my downfall sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, as the entire room watched the documentation of her betrayal. The final bombshell I revealed the most damning piece of evidence last. The secret contract where Apex Design had promised Elena a $2 million signing bonus and a guaranteed partnership in exchange for her sabotage. This was a mistake, and it wasn't a mental breakdown, I told the council, my voice echoing in the silent chamber. This was a calculated criminal conspiracy to build a death trap for the sake of profit. They were willing to let this library fall and kill innocent people just to take my firm. I looked at Elena, who was now trembling so violently she had to hold on to the back of her chair. The handcuffs in the fall at that moment, two plainclothes detectives from the white-collar crime division, whom I had invited weeks ago, stood up from the back of the room. They walked to the front of the chamber as the council members watched in stunned silence. Elena tried to run, but she was trapped between the rows of seats. The detectives placed her and Sterling under arrest for corporate sabotage, fraud, and reckless endangerment. The queen of the architectural world was let out in handcuffs, her expensive heels clicking on the marble floor as she screamed that it was all my fault. The immediate aftermath, the news of the scandal broke like a tidal wave. Apex Design was immediately barred from all public contracts and faced a barrage of lawsuits from their other clients. My firm, however, was suddenly the most sought-after name in the industry. The city council awarded us the library contract on the spot, with a public apology for ever doubting my integrity. But while the public victory was sweet, the internal cleanup was just beginning. I returned to my office and found that Elena had been even more destructive than I realized. Discovering the depth of the rot with the help of a forensic accountant, I spent the next month digging through our firm's secondary accounts. I discovered that Elena had been skimming small amounts of money, nearly $400,000 over 5 years, to fund her lavish lifestyle and her charitable image. She hadn't just betrayed me on this one project. She had been a parasite on the company since the very beginning. Every vacation she took, every designer dress she wore, had been paid for by my late nights and my technical labor. The betrayal wasn't sudden lapse. It was her entire business model. 19. Rebuilding from the foundations, I faced a difficult choice. Dissolve the firm and start over, or rebuild Thorne and Vance into something honest. I chose to rebuild. I promoted my lead engineer, Maria, a brilliant and honest woman who had been sidelined by Elena's ego for years. We established a new transparency protocol, a system where every design, every contract, and every dollar was tracked on a shared ledger. We became the first firm in the city to have an open books policy. I realized that the charismatic face of the business was never necessary. The work itself was the only spokesperson we needed. The trial of the decade, Elena's trial, was a media circus. Her lawyers tried to paint her as a victim of a controlling partner who had trapped her, but the digital evidence I had gathered was undeniable. The jury saw the deliberate way she had forged the documents and her cold, calculated messages about the inevitable collapse of the building. She was sentenced to 7 years in a federal penitentiary for fraud and conspiracy. Seeing her in a prison jumpsuit, stripped of her expensive jewelry and her practiced smiles, was a final closing of a dark chapter. The completion of the masterpiece 3 years later, the Grand Library was finally completed. It was a masterpiece of light glass and ironclad structural integrity. On the day of the ribbon-cutting ceremony, thousands of people walked through the West Wing, the very wing that Elena had tried to turn into a tomb. Standing in the center of the atrium, I felt a profound sense of peace. The building was strong because its foundation was honest. I realized then that my vision wasn't just about buildings. It was about the strength of character required to build them. A new legacy. I used the profits from the library project and the money recovered from Elena's seized assets to start a foundation for young, underprivileged architects. I wanted to teach them that mastery isn't about the spotlight or the charm. It's about the quiet, difficult work of being right. The foundation focused on technical excellence and ethical business practices, ensuring that the next generation of builders would never have to choose between their integrity and their success. My firm grew into an international leader, known for being the most ethical team in the business. The ultimate irony was that she thought her betrayal was a sophisticated plan to ascend to a higher level of power. In reality, She was just building her own cage. By selling a flawed design, she ensured that her new partners at Apex would be ruined the moment the project was scrutinized. She was so focused on my downfall that she didn't realize she had tied herself to a sinking ship of her own making. Her greed had made her technically blind, and that blindness was her undoing. I am still the quiet one, but my silence is no longer mistaken for weakness. It is respected as a sign of a man who is observing, calculating, and protecting the truth. I have a team I trust implicitly, and we work in an environment of total honesty. The trauma of the betrayal has faded, replaced by the profound satisfaction of knowing that I survived the worst and came out stronger. I am no longer just an architect of buildings. I am an architect of a better way to do business. I look out over the city. My buildings define the skyline now, not because they're the loudest, but because they're the most enduring. Elena is a shadow in the past, a ghost of a lesson learned with blood, sweat, and data. I am Leo Thorne, and I have moved from a mockery of a friend into the mastery of my own fate. The ascent was long and silent, but the view from the top is clearer than I ever imagined.